Hello everyone, thank you very much for joining the session today, the session from Aura. We're very pleased to welcome Strive, who are going to be presenting today a webinar titled Humans and the Machine, Who Will Win the Insight Battle. Today we're going to hear from two people from Strive, Mark Yeomans and Patrick Collins. Mark joins us today. He's over 20 years experience covering the financial services and technology sectors, and he's expert in a full range of qual and quant approaches, as well as working with a wide variety of secondary data sources. And Patrick, also from Strive, he joined last year from Kantar, where he was heavily involved in digital analytics, as well as working with conventional quantitative research tools. So we're very pleased to welcome both Mark and Patrick to be presenting the webinar today. Strive were recently voted by Aura members as winners of Aura's Best New Agency in 2019. So really pleased to hear from them today. And just before we go into the session, I'll just give you an indication of who's talking. So my name's Felicity. I'm a fellow Aura member. I'm working in the industry. I've got an insight role at a financial services company, Zurich Insurance, and I've volunteered to host today's webinar session. This is our second webinar that Aura are hosting, so looking forward to seeing how these work, how these improve insight and industry expertise for our Aura members. In today's session, we've got I think we've got 35 to 40 minutes scheduled for the webinar. We're going to hear from Strive, who will talk us through their presentation, but we will have time for questions at the end. So you should be able to, when you're on the webinar at the bottom panel, if you scroll down to the bottom, you will be able to see there is a chat and a Q&A buttons that you will be able to ask questions. So please send questions throughout the presentation, and we'll pause at the end to see what those questions are looking like, and I'll ask them to Mark and Patrick at the end. So I think that's it from my point of view. Really looking forward to the session. It's a really highly topical subject. I'm looking forward to hearing all about it. So if I hand over to Mark Yeomans.
Great, thank you, Felicity, and yeah, thanks for having us today. It's great to see so many people on the call today, and hopefully a few more will get to listen in the sort of when the webinar gets put up online. So, as a start point for today, I think it's very clear that over the next 10 to 20 years, machines and artificial intelligence will be replacing humans across a wide spectrum of jobs, ranging from manual jobs such as fruit picking through to complex intellectual tasks such as medical diagnosis. I think it's clear that our industry isn't immune from these transformations, and in particular, we've got the issue of increasing access to new and different data sources and new and different research and analytics tools. And these can be used to tell us what's happening today and potentially what's going to be happening tomorrow. Today, we're going to primarily focus on one of those new data sources, that of digital data, which we'll describe in more detail shortly. But in summary, that's any data that we can find online. So it obviously includes social media data, but as we'll come on to, it's much more than that. And we're going to talk about why digital data and the machines collecting it are a bit of a threat to us, but more importantly, how we need to embrace them and work with them so that they actually become part of our toolkit rather than some sort of existential threat. And as part of the talk today, we're going to look at a case study that uses both humans and machines to look at how consumers are reacting to artificial intelligence in financial services. Felicity was very kind to give us a quick intro, so I'm not going to dwell on this. Just that a colleague of mine earlier described us as old and new technology, and you can obviously guess which one I am from the photos on the screen at the moment. The one thing I would just dwell on here just to say is, while as an agency, I mean, we're all here, we're all traditional researchers here, so we still work largely with research, traditional research approaches, so lots of qual and quant. but we have an overarching philosophy that we just see that insight is everywhere. So we don't limit ourselves to where we think we might find the answers to our clients' challenges. So it could be conventional qual or quant research that we do, but we're increasingly accessing and using digital data and other data sources to deliver insight, and quite often blending the two to get to the answers that we need. So, are data and technology driving our demise? I mean, I think I've been around long enough to hear the death knell of research on several occasions, but along with other industries, there are, again, plenty of commentators thinking that advances in data and technology will ultimately lead to much of what we currently do no longer being required, or at the very least, certainly reduced in terms of volumes. And it is clear that data itself has a pretty compelling narrative. I'm sure that's not news to anyone here. But there's a couple of reasons behind that. I mean, firstly, there's just tons of data available, whether that's big data that gets produced from transactions and interactions we have with smartphones or websites or companies in general, or the digital data that we'll talk about more today, and that's the stuff that we produce every time we post on social media or we leave a review on a website. And all of that data has a lot of killer advantages, really, over conventional research data. I mean, it sounds an obvious one to start off with, but the information is real. It's not someone's perception or recall. It's not influenced by a researcher or a research medium. It's typically what's happened, and in most cases, as Pat will come on to describe, it's, we, as well as knowing what happened, we know when, we know who, and we know where, and quite often we can track what it actually leads to. And it's often the case as well that this new data is faster and cheaper, not all the time, but it's quite often a faster and cheaper way. The data is there, it exists. It's not always in the format and the structure that we'd like, but it is already there to be made use of. And these new data sources are already having some notable successes. So this is just a very quick example of how these new data sources can outperform our traditional ways of working. So 2016, both the US election and the EU referendum, traditional pollsters were generally predicting a Remain decision and a Clinton victory. And as obviously we know that neither of those did happen. But there's a company in the US called Brandseye who used a lot of social media data to actually come up with correct predictions. Now, what was interesting to us in this case study is that although they're a social media platform of sorts, they talk themselves about how they combine artificial intelligence and human crowds to produce their findings. So even for them, it's clearly not just about data sitting there and a machine spitting it out. They did have human intervention in getting to their conclusions. So if these new data sources are clearly valuable and potentially predicted to be important, it's maybe a little bit of a surprise that the volumes and the growth aren't as some are predicting. So the chart on the left there just shows how social media analytics has pretty much stalled in terms of use over the last 4 or 5 years. And on the right-hand side, we can see that even though all this data is around, the bulk of spend in our industry is still on conventional qual and quant research. There's probably a lot of stuff sitting behind those numbers, but our view is that one of the reasons it's not sort of getting the sort of traction it might is that we don't think these new data sources and the power of machines are being used in the optimal way to get to the outputs that we want. So clearly we need a framework of sorts to understand how the data, the machines and humans can work together in a better way. It's certainly not an either-or situation. We just need to understand where each of us is strong and how to complement and enhance each other's stuff. And at that point, I will hand over to Pat.
Thanks, Mark. And from all the work that we've done in this space and insights that we've gained from doing both traditional research and using new digital data sources, we see there being 3 key parts to the research process where we need to understand the roles of humans and machines. And that's the source, the analysis and the outputs. And these, of course, are all very fundamental things to all projects that we do. So we'll now evaluate the role of humans and machines in each one of these dimensions in turn. So starting with the data source, we now have lots of ready available data sources where the answers to many of our questions already exist, and many of them sit on digital platforms. And we use a technique called digital analytics, which extracts online conversations and combines them with both other digital data sources and traditional research for analysis and insight. And we use machines to collect this data at scale, and that's what we're going to talk about a lot today. And at the heart of it, we have explicit online conversations, as you can see in the middle there. And there are very few topics and audiences which can't be found on channels such as forums, blogs, search data, social media, news websites and reviews. And the insight that we can get back from it tends to be very rich and allows us to understand perceptions and opinions in a huge amount of detail. And beyond that, in the segments you can see on the outside, these are data sources which we combine with explicit online conversations, which we can use to tell a fuller story. So to go through each one of those in turn, firstly, we have metadata. So metadata is essentially data that describes other data. So if someone creates a post online, we can see who said it, their location, essentially allowing us to understand more about our audience. We also have behavioral panel data, of course, which tells us about people's cookies, the websites that they go on. But we can marry this up with explicit online conversations to help us understand what's driving this behavior. And of course, we have internal data as well. So there's never been a great opportunity to understand customers through app data, operational data. And on its own, it can tell us what is happening, but we marry it again up with the explicit online conversations to help tell us what's driving that behavior. And when it comes to tracking data, we know that it provides us with a top level metrics a lot of times, but a lot of the time, not the detail and diagnostics we need. So we can look back at the trends and look to see through explicit online conversations what's driving some of those key metrics. And lastly, we have third-party data. So a lot of the time, other organizations and agencies have done some very useful research. And there's no need for us to recreate this, but rather we can expand upon it from those learnings, again, using explicit online conversation to see if we can tell a fuller story. So essentially, you could say that the data sources around the outside the circle are helping us to understand more of the behaviors than ever, but we use explicit online conversations to determine what's driving it. And really, we should be focusing on digital data sources first, because many of the answers that we need already exist on these online platforms. However, even if we have all this data which is collected by machines, there are still limitations in terms of what it can give us. The first one is around inputting. These digital data sources can tell us what has happened or is happening, but they can't tell us about future scenarios. We can't test new ideas such as campaigns and propositions, and these things are very fundamental to research. We also can't probe. We can't ask people on digital platforms questions about their behavior. We have to take it at face value. So we're always going to need things like traditional qual to really get underneath the skin of various issues. And there's also usage bias. We know Twitter is often used to complain, Instagram for living your fake best life. So there's various biases that we have to be aware of. So you could say that human collected data or traditional research is always going to be needed. And we need humans to understand the various biases of digital sources. And sometimes we just need digital data, sometimes only traditional, and sometimes both. And we very much see our skill set in determining which ones to use and when to answer any given objective. And as well as digital data not always providing all the answers we might need, we also need some human involvement to get around some of these limitations. And let's go through a few of these now. The first one is volume. Essentially, there's just millions upon millions of data points online. It's just not really feasible for us to extract and try to analyze them all just with humans. The second one is around relevance. There's just so much noise online and irrelevant data. For example, if you've used a social media platform and you type in Costa, you'll get posts about Diego Costa, Costa del Sol, and so on. And that really undermines the data source validity. The third part's around accuracy. Algorithms yet just aren't really smart enough to give us what we need. They can give us the surface level detail in terms of volume, keywords, but not really the detail to drive strategic insights. And also there's authenticity. We know there's a lot of fake posts and reviews out there created by either people or bots. Again, this undermines the validity of our data sources. And it's very challenging to control the demographics. We can do this through traditional research, through quotas, but we know that some channels online skew to certain demographics. But the good news is we can overcome some of these issues if we put the right processes in place. And the way we do this is by combining humans and machines together. And essentially, there's two steps to doing this. And the first one is data extraction and processing. And we spend a lot of time identifying channels where relevant data exist. So either going to existing research or desk research to see where all relevant data is going to be. That's going to help us with our objectives. The next port of call is creating custom-built algorithms. So our data scientists will create an algorithm that will essentially extract a sample of data, they'll review that data and iteratively tweak it until we're absolutely sure that the data coming back is relevant. And that's how we clear out all that noise. And then the third point is around data cleaning. We can teach our algorithms how to spot a fake post by the words that it's used. And we can also use machines to help us structure all the open-ended comments online using neuro-linguistic programming, which can essentially detect the patterns in word that can give us a head start on identifying the core themes. And lastly, if we really need to, we can weight the data using our metadata in terms of age, gender, etc., to make it more representative. So you could almost say that the extraction process is very machine-led, but guided by humans to make sure it's doing the job properly. And the next step is applying quite familiar techniques to new data sources. So we do trend mining, which is looking at the momentum of themes in the data, theme quantification. So we'll take the initial themes that we got from the neuro-linguistic programming, and essentially we'll get our analysts to tweak them until they're as accurate as possible. And we'll do a lot of tonality mapping. So we'll look at all these various themes and identify whether they're positive, negative, neutral, etc. And then we'll do some cross-source analysis. We'll compare insights from multiple different sources and see if they're telling us different stories. And lastly, the way we tend to work with this data is very iterative. Because there's just so much of it, we need to think about what's the best way to work with it. So we like to have a very phased approach, which is quite telling of the work that we do normally. So for both elements, essentially, we need people who understand the data, who know how to manipulate it and use machines to do it at scale, and also how to translate the data into something meaningful. And then coming on to the output, and we think this area is something that is very much typical market research skills are very much needed for this. And we can look across the research process and we can see mainly this is a space that mainly humans can help with. Only humans can define the business problem that we're facing with and can decide on how to deliver it. Machines can help us analyze the problem at scale, but all they can really do is give us information, whereas only humans can translate it into commercial opportunities that meet our objectives. So we see the output part of the process is mainly being directed by humans. And we think it's very important to combine both the old and the new. And this means that there's two key benefits. Firstly, that it's efficient. All we need to do is find the data because it already exists. We don't need to physically be in the region to do the work. And it allows us to get more mileage out of internal data sources. And we can obtain views of quite niche brands and niche audiences, which is quite challenging to do via traditional research. And it also allows us to refine the scope of traditional research. We can make it more focused and make sure it just builds on top of knowledge that already exists. Also, it's more effective. The data quality is very high when using digital sources because it's organic. We can mine insights in situ rather than having to rely on the respondents' memories. And the data collected is also spontaneous, and that reduces the likelihood of research design bias. And also we've got a lot of depth and quality and quantity when using digital data sources. It allows us to understand the universe of themes and their prevalence. And so it's almost like qual, a quantitative scale, which really enables us to understand and uncover new behaviours. And we can even go back in time and measure the momentum of themes and needs. And really with traditional research, it allows it to focus on the aspects where it's stronger in terms of the more emotive aspects, the areas where people need to be probed, and to create data where it simply just doesn't exist yet. And what I want to do next is talk about how we've actually applied this process. And this is a paper that we presented at the MRS conference, Financial Services Conference last year alongside PSA consultants. And essentially what we were trying to do is understand trust in artificial intelligence within financial services. But you could say the findings are very relevant to other sectors as well who are trying to leverage this kind of technology. And in terms of methodologies, we were trying to integrate digital analytics into our existing toolkit. In this case, we were trying to see how it worked alongside traditional qualitative research. And I'm going to focus on the outcomes of each methodology and how they complemented each other to drive better insights. And the premise of our paper is that the current AI landscape just isn't helping to create trust in the technology. There's a huge amount of momentum in AI because of technological advancements, talent and focus, leadership and investment, and big brands are betting on it big to deliver on its imminent profit needs by being able to create more efficiency. There's also a huge amount of media influence because of polarizing opinions, overhype and fear-mongering, and the media emphasizing the wrong risks. And this has really culminated in consumers just being quite confused about what AI means to them, and we see a lot lower acceptance of AI within financial services compared to other categories. So the challenge that we were trying to overcome in this specific instance was, how do we convince consumers that artificial intelligence is the way forward? And to understand this, we did two things. The first one, we used digital analytics to extract over 700,000 consumer conversations taken from a number of different sources, including financial services forums, review websites, media coverage, search and social data, and government data. And essentially what this allowed to do was to identify the core themes in the market and gain unfiltered perspectives. And the second thing we did was a traditional qual. We did 8 one-on-one interviews with consumers from a different range of ages, income, and tech savviness. And that really allowed us to delve into the more deeper emotional issues that we couldn't have found in the analytics. So we see these two approaches as being very contrasting, and that's why we have that yin-yang symbol in here, because they're contrasting but very complementary. One providing breadth, the other depth, one more functional and the other more emotional. And now to dive into the findings. And one of the really interesting things that we found was that amongst the hundreds of thousands of conversations, we were able to look at what people were talking about in terms of the different kinds of brands. And as you can see here on the left, the fintech brands were coming out a lot stronger in terms of overall sentiment. And this was driven mainly by innovation, ease, and speed. And this was all the results of having new technology such as artificial intelligence. And consistent across all these brands was an element of self-serve, because people can essentially do more themselves. And that actually resulted in them learning more about their finances, which then resulted in greater satisfaction. So that's why you can see the high sentiment for those brands you can see at the top left there. Whereas you almost see the reverse of this for the more traditional brands, which have more challenges around how consumers having to rely on customer service agents to get the job done. So the real benefit from the analytics here was that we could get a strong quantification on all the brands, but at the same time, unpick all the underlying things driving this sentiment. However, despite this positivity, through our qual, it highlighted how we need to deliver an additional safety net in order to get consumers to consider new artificial related products and services within the categories. And this essentially had 3 dimensions. The first is the need to leverage the brand. There's pretty much an underlying fear that new fintech brands are going to go bust, mainly because they're not well known and people aren't really sure how the technology works. So If you can demonstrate how you're backed by third parties, such as the FCA, that can demonstrate that you're properly regulated. And also, if you can demonstrate that the brand has sourced new funds and new customers, this shows that the brands have longevity. So that helps engender greater trust. And consumers also want greater control. So in absence of actually understanding the technology, people want to review how algorithms make decisions and actually give permission in the short term when an algorithm is trying to make a decision on a person's behalf. And then the last element is to give control. In the case that something goes wrong, consumers just want to know that there's going to be a human they can speak to, who's going to take responsibility and will empathise in their situation. And quite simply, people just don't discuss this kind of thing online. We need to put consumers in situations to find out what are the underlying issues when trying to engage with artificial intelligence. And another element we looked at in quite a lot of detail was chatbots. And we looked at, via analytics, all conversations where people were talking about chatbots and normal customer service agents, specifically within financial services. And as you can see here, there's more negativity towards chatbots than customer service agents. And on the face of this was due to more functional issues. Chatbots not being smart enough to do various tasks. Mainly what they can do is answer FAQs. Also, chatbots are often used in the wrong context. People complaining about how they had to renegotiate their insurance subscriptions with a chatbot, where they'd much rather do that with a human. And a lot of the time, consumers just aren't made aware that they're speaking to a chatbot in the first place. They might be speaking to what they think is a human for a few minutes, and then it's suddenly quite clear that they're actually speaking to a chatbot. And this essentially makes consumers feel like they're being duped. And this has resulted in only 7% of people preferring to use a chatbot over a human. However, qualitatively, this unearthed more emotive challenges around chatbots. And the first point is that consumers just don't think chatbots can really handle subjectivity. Can it look at multiple different data sets and make the best decision based on that? And trust diminishes quite a lot when impersonating a human. Inherently, people just don't like something pretending to be something it's not. And chatbots are usually made to actually look like a human too. And a lot of chatbots have quite a human-like tone, and consumers actually just find that quite patronising when they're communicating with it. And lastly, we combined both internal data and analytics to look at, what are the potential watch-outs for the future. And we found almost 4 in 5 customer service agents like the idea of chatbots because it frees up more of their time to answer more complex issues, which helps improve their skills. And also, as you can see on the right here, despite overall there being more negativity, there is considered to be some potential in the future with consumers considering there's a lot of availability and speed via chatbots. So to sum up with this case study, we wouldn't have wanted to have done any of these methodologies isolated on their own. Through the qual, we got more emotional aspects and barriers, but via analytics, we were able to get some quantification and just stumble on things we just didn't expect to in the first instance. So lastly, just want to revisit the key areas where we think it's important to think about how we should be using humans and machines. And in terms of the source, we need to identify when and how to turn to machines. Machines are going to be providing us with existing data, such as big data and extracting information from the internet, and they help us extract it from scale. Whereas humans are going to be creating more specific new content, traditional research, essentially when the answers don't already exist via digital platforms, and when we need to probe and we need to find out about the more emotive issues. Whereas in terms of the analysis, we need to work with machines rather than outsource or automate. Machines can help us with the initial analysis and help us do it at scale. All they can really do is automate or do what they're told. Whereas humans need to instruct machines on what to do and review the data coming from both traditional sources and new data sources and decide on what really matters. And in terms of the output, only humans and commercial thinkers can translate the output into actual business implications. The machine, all they can do is provide data information, whereas humans can provide directions, recommendation, inspiration, and clarity. So nothing is really killing anything. It's just that our toolkit is just expanding. We just need to understand what's the balance of using humans and machines in specific areas. And lastly, we see digital analytics being relevant right across the business lifecycle, from strategy and product creation right through to CX feedback. And that covers everything that we wanted to talk about today. We hope you found that interesting and useful, and appreciate it's a lot to take in. So feel to ask any questions on the chat or get in touch later.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mark and Pat. That was absolutely brilliant. Really, really interesting presentation. I liked the fact that there were sort of two parts to their presentation. The first was, you know, the understanding how the two different types of research can be used together, so the traditional versus the new, and then the research piece around the consumer perception of artificial intelligence and all of the new tools and things that are being used now. So really interesting. Thank you for that. If you have any questions, please can you post some questions on the Q&A. In the meantime, I do have a couple, so I will fire off with mine, and then we'll see how we go. So firstly, Mark and Pat, the first section of your presentation, which was more around how you've used the two approaches, traditional and you know, data. Have you got any good examples of when you have applied that, or some case studies, just so that in terms of from an insight perspective, what sorts of projects would be ideal for where you would want to blend the two data sources?
Yeah, I mean, as ever with these things, we have to be careful of client confidentiality. But I think one of the areas one of the sort of, I guess, when we think this approach is really good for sort of niche audiences, and particularly when you're getting into, I guess, samples that would be hard to find either via a panel or traditional recruitment. I mean, as long as you're directing the search in the right way, you can get at the right sorts of people. So I mean, that's been done for people in very specific roles in small businesses, because they will have forums that they're part of that you can gain access to.
Yeah, as an example of work that I've done, I did a project on SMEs who are trading internationally, and we were helping a UK bank essentially develop its proposition. So we were able to look at essentially small businesses on various forums, specifically talking about international trade, and it was just very easy to find these people, but by a traditional method, it would just be a lot more challenging.
Really interesting. Thank you for that. We've had a question through on the Q&A. Don't know if you've seen that one. Is there a volume of data that would tip into AI being preferable rather than using humans to read through unstructured data?
I think there's probably not one specific, but once you're going over 500 comments or something like that, then just getting people to analyze it just takes far too long. And also we find that if you take one person analyze a set of data versus another person, they actually come up with different sets of themes. So by getting a machine to do it, actually they can give you the starting benchmark. And as long as it can actually analyze the data a bit more consistently. So yeah, once you start to go above those numbers, it can just take forever to do a project that way.
Great. So for 500, I think is yeah. So it's a rule of thumb. Great. And we've had another one in from Kate. Can you explain a bit more about the idea of weighting online data? What kind of data would you do this with?
Yeah, so the reason we would do this, so say if we were using something like Twitter and we had got a bunch of insights from it, and we just think, oh, Twitter's used mainly by young men. What we can do is we can make the sample more representative. So we could look at demographics and ages and essentially make young men count for less in the numbers. So when we're actually looking at the themes coming through from the data, we can compare when we weight it, is it actually looking different to when we just take the raw sample as it is? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing
Yep.
how much data does have that sort of stuff attached to it. I mean, I think some of the social media platforms they're obviously keyed into the fact that they've got a valuable resource now. So I think if you're going to the likes of, certainly Facebook will charge for getting access to this. So we can't just assume it's all free, but they do have quite a bit of other stuff attached that helps you to sort of go through something like a weighting process.
Great. No, that's really interesting, actually, really useful. Thank you. And some more, still very, very, it seems to be the hot topic. People really interested in exactly how you do the analysis and what you're using, how you're using the data. So, question from Darren: do you work internationally, and if so, how do you cope with translation at scale, culturally relevant analysis, etc.? I don't know if you've had any experience of international work.
Yes, we do, to answer that question, and it's a really good question. And because this work has so much human involvement, we do need to use a linguist when we're doing international work. So yeah, when we're using our data scientists, we've got a number of them who are tapped into people who speak a number of different languages. So to answer the question, yes, we do it, but yeah, it is a bit more of a challenge when we're trying to do a number of different languages.
Great, thank you. And it looks like the last question from Kate: how do you account, so again on the data analysis, how do you account for the different contexts in which the data you are gathering has come from?
Yeah, I mean, we look at the sources quite independently a lot of the time. So for example, I was doing a project recently for a tequila brand, and the insights coming back from the various different channels were just so different. When we looked at one forum that was specifically dedicated to tequila, and a lot of the top brands that you find a lot of bars and restaurants were actually rated quite poorly. Everyone was quite negative about it, and that was mainly because these people are essentially connoisseurs of tequila. But when you look at the more mainstream kind of forums, you see that these brands are a lot more popular. People are saying really good things about them. So you really need to consider the data source you're getting the insight from. So we spend quite a lot of our time thinking about who is on these forums. Again, then their data, a lot of the time is attached to it, so we can look at their demographics. We can learn a lot about the context of the forum, about who's on it and the richness and how much detail they're providing. And then we can think about, if it's a more widely used forum or channel, we can sort of take, usually the opinions are quite representative. So yeah, it really is a source by source basis that we make those considerations from.
I think it's also where we like to try and get the clients involved as well, because they'll often know about these sources, and this is why quite often with the analysis it's iterative, because you can't just take a data source and sort of analyze it at face value and think that's the answer. And as Pat said, you have to sort of look at where it's coming from, who's on it, what's the sort of the setup for that, which again is where humans need to be involved, rather than just going to a social media platform and typing in tequila and hoping a lot of stuff comes out without making too much effort.
Great, thank you. I think that's an excellent example. I think examples really do help to bring it all to life about how you use the data, so thank you for that. And we've had another question in from Jane. Are you okay to go on a couple more minutes?
Yeah.
NLP has been referred to. If demographics aren't available for comments, are they able to use the language used in the comments to identify demographics? So I don't know if you've again got experience with this.
Yeah, it does work for some things. I guess the only problem is sometimes, even if say German might be spoken in other different languages. But there are certain ways that our analysts can look at the IP addresses of people who've made these kind of comments, so we can detect the location of where people are. So yeah, to answer your question, is we can do that.
And I think in certainly when we've had comments analysed from Zurich's point of view, we've had feedback along the lines of the age of the demographic. So they've, it's quite clear that there is some linguistics in there around identifying types of people, which is quite interesting, I think, in terms of insight. Well, thank you so much for that. I thought it was a really interesting session. I think it's great to see that the humans are still needed to tell the machines what to do. And I really like your challenge that the toolkit is changing and our roles are expanding. And what we need to do, we need to keep abreast of that and to think about how that is changing our roles and make sure we all as insight professionals are aware of that and up to the challenge really of incorporating these different toolkits and adapting our roles as we need to keep ourselves relevant to our organisations. So thank you very much to Strive. Thank you very much to Mark and to Pat. Excellent session. As I said, we've recorded the session, so it will be available to other people. If you're aware that other people would like to listen to the webinar, it will be on our website. And if you need to find out more about Aura at all, please go to the website, Aura website, and find out everything you need to know about us. So thank you for joining, and have a good day.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.